The sky was burning. Commander Elias Voss stood on the bridge of the Warhound, the last remaining human warship in Earth's orbit. Through the shattered remains of the once mighty defense fleet, he watched helplessly as Dominion warships rained fire upon his homeworld. Great cities that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust. Skyscrapers melted under the intense heat of plasma bombardment. The oceans boiled where the enemy's energy bombs had struck. The war had been long, brutal, and filled with desperate battles. But now it was over, and humanity had lost. The Galactic Dominion, an empire that had ruled the stars for thousands of years, had declared humanity a threat. They had given only one warning: surrender or be destroyed. Humanity refused. They fought with everything they had: ships, weapons, soldiers, and sheer determination. But it hadn't been enough. Now all that remained of the Terran defense fleet were burning wrecks drifting through space. Warhound was the last ship still fighting, but even it wouldn't last much longer. "Commander, our shields are failing," shouted Lieutenant Kira Novak, her voice barely audible over the blaring alarms. Sparks flew from her console as another enemy blast shook the ship. Voss tightened his grip on the command rail. His knuckles turned white, but his face remained calm. He had fought in hundreds of battles. He had lost ships, lost men, lost friends. But this was different. This was extinction. "Divert all power to forward shields," he ordered. "We don't have shields left, sir," Novak said grimly. That last hit took out the generators. Another explosion rocked the ship. A fire burst from the engineering section, and crew members scrambled to put it out. The Warhound was dying. On the main screen, a massive Dominion warship loomed ahead. A dreadnought, 5 times the size of Warhound, its hull covered in energy cannons and missile bays. It was the enemy's flagship, the personal warship of High General Ralzok, the one who had led this invasion. They're charging weapons. Voss exhaled slowly. So this was how it would end. "Sir, incoming transmission," Novak said. The bridge speakers crackled, and a deep, growling voice filled the air. "Humans," Ralzok's voice was filled with cold amusement. "Your warriors are dead. Your leaders are gone. Your cities burn. And soon, your species will be nothing but dust." Voss clenched his jaw. "We'll never surrender," he growled. Ralzok laughed. "Oh, I know. That is why you must be erased." The dreadnought's main cannon powered up. A massive ball of energy formed at its core, aimed directly at Warhound. "Brace for impact," Novak yelled. The ship trembled violently as another blast struck the lower decks. Explosions erupted. Smoke filled the bridge. Crew members coughed, their eyes burning. Then, through the chaos, a desperate voice came through the comms. "Commander, evacuation transports are escaping. We need cover." Voss's eyes widened. Survivors. Not many, but some. If they could escape into deep space, humanity wouldn't die today. He turned to Novak. "How many ships?" "5, sir. Mostly civilian transports. Light-speed drives are charging, but they need more time." Voss looked back at the enemy dreadnought. If it fired now, those transports would be destroyed before they could jump. There was only one thing left to do. He made his decision. "Novak," he said, his voice steady, "plot a collision course." Novak froze. "Sir." "We're done," Voss said. "But if we take that ship with us, those transports will get away." A moment of silence. Then, every officer on the bridge straightened. "Aye, sir," Novak said, determination in her voice. The engines roared. Warhound turned, heading straight for the Dominion dreadnought at full speed. Ralzok's laughter stopped. "What are you doing?" Voss smirked. "Making sure you remember us." The Dominion dreadnought fired, but it was too late. Warhound slammed into the ship's side, and the universe turned white in a blinding explosion. Somewhere, in the cold darkness of space, a few human ships slipped away, carrying the last survivors of Earth. The war was over, but the fight had just begun. The darkness of space stretched endlessly before them, silent and unforgiving. 5 battered ships, once civilian transports, now carried the last remnants of humanity. Inside, the survivors barely breathed as they drifted through the void, hiding from the watchful eyes of the Dominion fleet. Commander Elias Voss had survived. Barely. He sat in the small, dimly lit command deck of the Nova's Light, one of the few ships that had managed to escape the destruction of Earth. His body ached, his wounds barely patched, but none of that mattered. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He was one of the last high-ranking officers left. That meant leadership. That meant survival. Through the reinforced glass of the viewport, he saw the other 4 ships, each scared from battle. Their hulls were dented, engines barely holding together, and life support systems failing. But they were alive. For now. "Commander," a voice crackled through the intercom. It was Lieutenant Kara Novak, also one of the few remaining officers. Scanners showed Dominion patrols nearby. "We have to keep moving." Voss exhaled. "Can we risk a light-speed jump?" There was a pause. "No, sir. Our drives need time to cool down. Another jump too soon, and they could tear us apart." Voss ran a hand down his face. The Dominion had taken everything from them. Earth, their fleet, their people. Now they were nothing but ghosts in the dark. "We need a hiding spot," Novak continued. "Somewhere to repair, refuel, and figure out what the hell we do next." Voss leaned forward, scanning the star map. Their options were limited. The Dominion controlled almost every system nearby, and any attempt to refuel at an outpost would get them killed. But then he saw it. The graveyard. A massive asteroid field filled with the wreckage of ancient warships, the remains of battles fought centuries ago. It was dangerous, filled with unstable debris and hidden dangers. But most importantly, it was off the Dominion's radar. "We go there," Voss decided. "Sir, that place is a death trap," Novak warned. "Maybe," Voss admitted, "but it's better than waiting to be hunted down." Set course. The Nova's Light and the remaining transports adjusted their trajectories. Engines flickered to life, and the small fleet drifted toward the graveyard, vanishing into the darkness. Hours passed. Inside the ships, the survivors moved quietly, whispering in hushed voices. Soldiers tended to their wounds, engineers worked frantically to repair systems, and civilians sat in corners, staring at nothing. They had lost their home, their families, everything they had ever known. Now, they were refugees in the cold emptiness of space. Voss walked through the cramped corridors, nodding at those he passed. Some saluted, others simply watched him, their eyes filled with unspoken questions. How do we fight back? Where do we go next? Is humanity finished? He had no answers. Not yet. The ship shuddered as they entered the asteroid field. Voss returned to the command deck, where Novak and the other officers monitored their approach. The graveyard stretched before them, an endless maze of broken ships, shattered hulls, and drifting metal. "It's worse than I expected," Novak muttered. Voss said nothing. The remains of warships, some larger than entire cities, floated in eerie silence. Some belonged to long-extinct species, their weapons still intact, their skeletons frozen in the vacuum of space. It was a place of death. But it was also a place of opportunity. "If we're lucky," Voss said, "we might find something useful in here. Weapons, supplies, anything that can help us survive." Novak nodded, though the worry never left her face. "And if we're unlucky?" Voss didn't answer. The ships moved deeper into the field, weaving carefully through the wreckage. The survivors held their breath as the metal remains of ancient warships loomed around them like the ghosts of fallen empires. Then something moved. "Sir," a crewman whispered, eyes wide. "We're not alone." Voss turned to the scanner. A signal pulsed in the distance. Faint, weak, but it was there. A ship. A living ship. The question was, friend or enemy. The survivors of humanity drifted through the vast asteroid field known as the Graveyard, a silent realm of shattered warships and forgotten battles. Commander Elias Voss stood in the command center of the Nova's light, staring at the scanner. The weak signal they had detected earlier was still there, flickering like a dying heartbeat. No movement, no response to their hails. Just silence, and that silence made everyone uneasy. Lieutenant Kara Novak adjusted the controls, narrowing the scan radius. "Still no response," she said. "If it's a ship, it's either dead or powered down." Voss didn't like it. "Could be a trap," he muttered. "Or it could be exactly what we need." The survivors were running out of time. Their supplies were dangerously low, their engines barely functional, and their weapons were almost useless. If that ship had food, fuel, or, by some miracle, working weapons, it could mean the difference between survival and extinction. "Prep a team," Voss ordered. "We're going in." A boarding party was quickly assembled. 6 of their best fighters, including Novak, armed with what little firepower they had left. Their target was an old warship, its hull covered in battle scars. The name was barely visible under layers of dust and scorch marks. Ironclad. The boarding shuttle detached from the Nova's light, gliding silently through the graveyard. The closer they got, the more eerie the ironclad appeared. Its exterior was battered, but intact. No visible breaches, no gaping holes from past battles. Just stillness. It felt wrong. "Something's off," Novak whispered. Voss gripped his rifle. "Stay sharp." The shuttle latched onto the docking port with a metallic clang. Airlocks hissed open. Darkness greeted them inside. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting shadows along the walls. The air was stale but breathable. Novak activated her flashlight, scanning the corridor. "No bodies," she noted. "No blood. Where's the crew?" The group moved cautiously, rifles raised, their boots echoing through the empty halls. They reached the bridge. The controls were still operational, though barely. Flickering screens displayed ancient battle logs, records of a war fought long before humanity had even left its solar system. "This ship's been here for centuries," Novak said, skimming the logs. "But something doesn't add up. The power core is still functioning, and the life support systems are operational. That shouldn't be possible after this long." Voss frowned. "Unless someone else has been here." A sudden noise echoed from deep within the ship. A metallic scrape. Then another. Novak turned sharply. Movement. 30 meters down the corridor. Voss signaled for silence. The team advanced, following the sound. The corridor led to the lower deck, where the storage compartments were located. As they neared, the air grew colder. Their breath misted. The doors to the storage bay were slightly open. Something had forced them apart. Voss gestured for 2 soldiers to take position. On his mark, they pushed the doors fully open. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything. Then, eyes. Dozens of glowing red orbs flickered to life, embedded in the metallic skulls of ancient war machines. Their bodies were humanoid, but their frames were built for war. Thick armor plating, integrated weapons, and limbs designed for brute force. "Drones," Novak whispered, "but they're old." Deactivated. Voss approached cautiously. The machines remained still, their optics dim. "These aren't Dominion tech," he muttered. "There's something else. Something older." One of the soldiers stepped too close. His foot scraped against the floor. A sharp metallic click echoed through the chamber. The drone's eyes turned bright red. Then they moved. The first one lunged, metal claws swiping through the air. The soldier barely dodged, firing his rifle. Bullets ricocheted off the machine's armor. More drones stirred, their ancient bodies groaning as they powered up. "Fall back," Voss ordered. Gunfire erupted. The team retreated, firing as they moved, but the bullets barely slowed the machines. One soldier screamed as a drone grabbed him, crushing his arm with terrifying strength. Another drone raised its built-in cannon, an energy weapon that shouldn't have been functional after centuries of disuse. "Move! Move!" Novak shouted. They reached the airlock, slamming the emergency override. The doors hissed shut just as a drone lunged forward, its claws scraping against the metal. The team barely had time to breathe before the entire ironclad rumbled. Something deep within the ship had awakened. Back on the Nova's light, alarms blared. The weak signal that had first drawn them here was now surging with power. "The ship is coming online," a crewman shouted. "Weapons systems are activating." Voss and his team barely made it back to their shuttle before the ironclad's automated defenses came to life. Turrets unfolded from the hull, charging with energy. The once dead warship was no longer lifeless. It was waking up, and it was not alone. Across the graveyard, more signals appeared. Old warships, broken machines, forgotten relics of past battles. Something had reawakened them. And now, the last survivors of humanity were trapped in a battlefield that had been silent for centuries. But not anymore. The Nova's light drifted cautiously through the graveyard, the silent remains of long-forgotten battles stretching endlessly in every direction. Every ship, every wreck was a reminder of wars fought and lost, of empires that had crumbled before humanity had even reached the stars. But now something ancient was stirring. The ironclad had awakened, its automated systems powering up after centuries of dormancy, and it wasn't alone. Commander Elias Voss stood on the bridge, watching as more and more signals appeared on the scanner. Weak at first, but growing stronger. The ironclad had been the first to wake up. Now, the others were following. "This is bad," Novak muttered, staring at the display. "We should leave. Right now." Voss didn't argue. He turned to his crew. "How fast can we get the engines back online?" Chief Engineer Ramos, a grizzled veteran of too many close calls, wiped the sweat from his brow. "They're holding together, but barely. If we push them too hard, they'll rip themselves apart." Voss didn't like that answer. But they had no choice. The graveyard was coming back to life, and if they stayed here too long, they'd be buried in it. "Get us moving," he ordered. The Nova's light shuddered as the engines fired up. The ship lurched forward, navigating through the maze of wreckage. But before they could reach open space, something massive blocked their path. A battleship. Not just any battleship, one of the Dominion's warships. The same alien empire that had nearly wiped out humanity, the ones who had forced them to flee into the depths of space. But this ship was old, rusted, scarred by countless battles. And now it was awake. "Dominion warship," Novak said, voice tight. "Designation: Judicator." Voss cursed under his breath. "I thought the Dominion never lost ships." "They don't," Novak said. "Not unless something took them down." Before Voss could respond, the Judicator's engines flared to life. The ancient warship turned toward them, its massive cannons shifting into position. And then, the transmission came through. A voice, garbled and distorted, crackled over the speakers. It wasn't Dominion. It wasn't human. It was something else. "You do not belong here." A deep mechanical growl. More than one voice. Layered, broken, stitched together from 1,000 dying transmissions. The Nova's lights crew froze. Then the scanners screamed with warnings. The Judicator was locking weapons. "Brace for impact," Voss shouted. The first energy blast tore past them, narrowly missing the hull. The second wasn't as kind. Shields flared as the impact sent shockwaves through the ship. Consoles sparked. Lights flickered. "We can't take another hit like that," Novak yelled. Voss gritted his teeth. "Return fire." Their own cannons roared to life. Missiles streaked through the darkness, slamming into the Judicator's hull. Explosions rippled across its surface, but the ancient warship barely seemed to notice. Then, something changed. The Judicator's weapons stopped. The ship froze in place, as if it were hesitating. And then, a new signal appeared on the scanners. Not Dominion. Not human. Something else. The graveyard was waking up, and whatever controlled it had just turned its attention toward them. You do not belong here. The voice repeated, louder this time. The Judicator shuddered, as if something unseen was pulling at it. The warship's massive cannons turned, not toward the Nova's light, but toward the other wrecks around them. And then, chaos erupted. The graveyard came alive. Warships that had been silent for centuries suddenly activated. Their ancient weapons roared, tearing into each other. Old grudges, old battles that had never ended, resumed as if no time had passed. The Nova's light was caught in the middle of a battlefield that had been frozen in time, until now. Get us out of here, Voss bellowed. Ramos didn't argue. The engines screamed as they pushed forward, weaving between the warring titans. Explosions rocked the graveyard. Wreckage spun past them. The Judicator fired its cannons at unseen enemies, its hull taking massive hits from ships just as ancient and deadly. But the worst was yet to come. Something massive loomed in the darkness, a shadow that blocked the stars. And then the voice returned, clearer this time. You were never meant to survive. The graveyard wasn't just a battleground. It was a tomb. And someone, had decided that humanity didn't belong in it. The Nova's light shot through the graveyard, the wreckage of ancient warships drifting past like the scattered bones of long-dead giants. The crew had barely managed to escape the grasp of the Judicator, an old Dominion warship that had awakened from its slumber. But now, as they raced through the dark expanse, their problems were far from over. Elias Voss, the ship's commander, stood at the helm, his mind racing. He had lived through many battles, seen the galaxy tear itself apart, but never had he seen something like this. The graveyard wasn't just a junkyard of forgotten ships. It was a prison, a place where no one was meant to survive. The warring factions that had once clashed in these depths were now rising again, ancient enemies with long-forgotten grudges. He looked to Novak, his tactical officer. What's the status on the scanners? Any new readings? Novak, pale and wide-eyed, stared at the console. There's something else, Commander. A huge energy signature, just ahead. It's not Dominion, not anything we've ever encountered. And it's active. Voss frowned. How long until we reach it? Too close for comfort. At this rate, we'll be in its range in under 10 minutes. The tension in the air thickened. Voss turned toward the crew, his voice calm but firm. Prepare for whatever comes. We don't know what we're dealing with. As the Nova's light accelerated, the massive energy signature grew clearer. It wasn't a ship. It was something else, something buried deep within the graveyard itself. The wreckage seemed to form a ring around the source of the energy, as if keeping watch over it, guarding it from prying eyes. Voss felt a chill crawl down his spine. There was no doubt now. Whatever had caused this battle to restart had a mind of its own. The ship's lights flickered as another blast rocked them from behind. It was the Judicator, still trailing them, still firing. The warship wasn't going to give up so easily. We're not going to outrun it, Novak said, his voice strained. We need to find a way to lose it, or we're dead. Voss nodded, thinking quickly. Chief, can we fire back with the cannons? Disrupt their tracking. Ramos, the chief engineer, was already at the weapons console. He was sweating, the pressure of the moment weighing heavily on him. We have some limited firepower, but we're running low on ammo. I can't guarantee we'll take it down. We don't need to take it down, Voss replied. We need to slow it down. He turned to Novak. Can we jam their systems? Novak nodded. It's risky, but I can try. If I can get into their targeting array, we might be able to confuse their sensors long enough for us to make a break. Voss gave a sharp nod. Do it. The tension on the bridge grew as Novak worked. His fingers flew over the console, tapping commands at a frantic pace. The hum of the ship's systems echoed in the silence as everyone held their breath. A low, rumbling sound reverberated through the ship. The Judicator had fired again, but this time, The blast missed, just barely. The ship's cannon had faltered for a moment. The targeting system distorted. It worked, Novak yelled. Voss didn't have time to celebrate. Full speed ahead, Chief. Get us to that energy signature. The Nova's light lurched forward, engines roaring to life as the crew braced themselves. The Judicator fired again, but the blast missed, the shot lost in the wake of their evasive maneuvers. The massive warship had been temporarily blinded, but it was only a matter of time before its systems recalibrated. The strange energy signature grew stronger with every passing second. Voss could feel it in his bones, a pull that was both alien and ancient. It was drawing them in. Something about this place was magnetic, its gravity too strong to ignore. "Commander," Novak said urgently, "I'm seeing something strange. The wreckage in front of us. It's moving. It's shifting, like it's alive." Voss turned toward the viewport. The debris around them was moving. Ships that had been still for centuries, their hulls battered and torn, were now stirring to life. The engines of a massive battleship came to life, its dark silhouette slowly turning to face them. It was too big to be a warship. This was something else entirely. A transmission crackled through their comms, distorted and low. "You were never meant to find this." The voice was cold, mechanical. There was no emotion, just an eerie calm. It was a warning, but Voss knew it was more than that. It was a threat. Novak looked at the scanners. "Commander, we've got multiple ships moving toward us. They're not friendly." Voss clenched his fists. "I figured as much." The view outside the viewport became more and more chaotic. The wreckage of 1,000 ships swirled around them, now shifting into formations. Ancient weapons powered up, ancient enemies ready to fight once more. The Judicator wasn't the only ship hunting them now. They were surrounded. "We have no choice now," Voss said grimly. "Prepare for battle. We fight our way through." He turned to Ramos. "Get the engines ready for a full-speed jump. We need to escape, but we'll have to make it through this alive first." The crew braced themselves as the Nova's light charged ahead, toward the massive energy signature and the rising battle. They were caught in a storm of ancient forces, and survival was no longer a matter of if. They had only one question left to answer: who would make it out alive? As the crew readied themselves for what came next, they had no idea that this was only the beginning. The real enemy wasn't the ships or the weapons. It was whatever force controlled this ancient battlefield. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for a long, long time, and now humanity was in its sights. The true horror of the graveyard had just begun. The Nova's light was barely holding together as it careened through the wreckage of the graveyard. The crew's faces were a mix of dread and determination, knowing that their chances of survival grew slimmer with each passing minute. But they had no choice but to push forward. Voss, staring at the chaos outside the viewport, could only wonder how this had escalated so quickly. They had come seeking refuge, but now they had become part of something far larger, a war that had been long forgotten, yet was somehow destined to involve humanity. The massive ship, once a shining beacon of hope, now felt more like a floating tomb. Every movement of the ship rattled, a reminder of the damage they had sustained during their escape. The hull groaned with every impact, each sound making the crew tense up, waiting for the worst. The Judicator was still out there, somewhere in the dark, but now it was not the only threat. The ancient ships, reanimated by the strange force in the graveyard, were closing in. "Commander," Novak's voice cut through the tension. "The fleet is closing in. I count at least 12 ships, each one bigger than the last. They're forming a perimeter around us." Voss didn't need to hear the exact count. He could see it for himself through the viewport. The enemy ships weren't just following them, they were cornering them. The graveyard had become a death trap, and the Nova's light was now the prey. "We need to break free," Voss said firmly, though a sense of dread gripped his chest. "Can we make the jump?" Ramos, still working furiously at the controls, wiped the sweat from his brow. "We can make the jump, but it won't be smooth. The engines are strained from the last burst of power. If we don't get out of here soon, we'll be sitting ducks for their weapons." Voss nodded. "Then we make the jump now. Prepare for a rough ride, everyone." As the crew scrambled to their stations, the ship shuddered once more, this time far harder than before. The Judicator had found them again, and its weapons were firing, each blast sending shockwaves through the ship. Voss could hear the warning alarms blaring in the distance, but his mind was on one thing: escape. Initiating jump sequence. Ramos yelled from the control panel. The ship's engines roared as they fired up, the bright blue light of the warp drive igniting. But as the Nova's light powered up to jump, something went wrong. The jump drive stuttered, sputtering under the strain. They weren't going anywhere. "The jump drive's malfunctioning," Ramos shouted. "We're stuck." Voss cursed under his breath. The battle had only just begun, and now they had no way out. The Judicator's cannons fired again, a devastating shot that sent sparks flying through the bridge. The ship lurched to the side, throwing everyone off balance. Voss barely managed to keep his feet, gripping the console in front of him. "Damage report," he barked. "Shields down to 20%. Novak reported, his voice shaking. "Hull integrity is compromised. We can't take much more of this." Voss's mind raced. They had no shields, no way to jump out of the system, and no way to outrun the enemy. The odds were stacked against them. But then, a flicker of hope. The strange energy signature that had drawn them to the graveyard, it was growing stronger. Could it be a source of power? Something that could help them turn the tide? Voss didn't have time to figure it out. The ships closing in on them were too dangerous, too many. "We're not dying here," Voss muttered under his breath. "Not today." He turned to his crew. "Prepare to fight. We'll make a stand. If we can't escape, we'll make sure they remember humanity." The crew looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They had faced impossible odds before, and they would do it again. Voss looked out the viewport, his mind sharp. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. "Full power to the weapons, Chief," Voss ordered. "Target the largest ship in the fleet. I want them to feel the weight of humanity's wrath." Ramos didn't hesitate. He was a seasoned engineer, but this was different. There was a fierce determination in his eyes as he turned to the weapons controls. "Aye, Commander." Powering up weapons now. The Nova's light shuddered again, but this time, the weapons systems hummed with power. The ship's cannons roared to life, sending volleys of energy blasts toward the enemy fleet. It was a desperate attack, but it was all they had. The enemy ships, though massive and powerful, had not expected humanity to fight back with such ferocity. The blasts slammed into the lead ship, sending it spiraling out of control. But the damage was only temporary. The enemy forces regrouped quickly, firing back with brutal precision. "They're adapting too quickly," Novak shouted, his hands flying over the console. "They're locking onto us. We need to do something. Now." Voss's mind raced. The ancient ships in the graveyard were alive with energy. What if the energy signature was more than just a power source? What if it was a weapon? Could they turn it against their enemies? "Chief," Voss called, "can you get us to that energy source? We need to get close enough to tap into it." Ramos, sweating and exhausted, nodded. "I can try. But if it's a trap, we're done." "I'll take that chance," Voss replied, gripping the armrests of his seat. "We don't have a choice." With a sharp turn, the Nova's light moved toward the center of the graveyard, heading straight for the swirling mass of ancient wreckage. The energy signature was pulsing in a rhythm now, like a heartbeat, a force too powerful to ignore. The Judicator continued to fire, its shots lighting up the void of space, but the Nova's light was too fast, too agile. They weaved in and out of the wreckage, getting closer and closer to the source of the strange energy. "We're almost there," Ramos shouted over the noise of the ship's failing systems. Voss gripped the console, determination in his eyes. They were close now, so close. But the question remained, would they be able to harness this unknown force before the enemy could destroy them? As the Nova's light neared the epicenter of the energy signature, the ship shuddered violently. They were on the edge now, and the next few moments would determine whether humanity would survive this fight or fall into oblivion. The crew was ready. They would fight with everything they had. And if the ancient force within the graveyard was willing to help, then they would show the galaxy just why humanity was not to be underestimated. The battle was far from over, and the real fight had just begun. The ship's crew was at the edge of their limits. The Nova's light was battered, its systems nearly failing, but the crew had no intention of surrendering. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward, fighting with everything they had. The energy signature from the graveyard pulsed in the distance, growing stronger with each passing second. Voss's eyes were locked on the readouts on his console. If they could just reach that source, they might have a chance. But time was running out. The enemy fleet, relentless and unforgiving, was still on their tail. Full power to engines, Chief. Push the limits. Voss barked, his voice strained but resolute. Ramos, his face drenched in sweat, was fighting to keep the ship operational. I'm giving it everything, Commander. But if we push any further, we risk the engines burning out completely. Do it anyway, Voss replied, his tone cold and unwavering. We don't have time to hesitate. We need to hit that energy source before it's too late. The Nova's light accelerated, her hull groaning as the engines strained beyond their limits. The ancient wreckage of the graveyard was looming large ahead, the eerie glow from the energy source cutting through the darkness like a beacon. But the enemy wasn't far behind. The Judicator and its fleet were closing in, relentless in their pursuit, their cannons lighting up the space around them with every shot. They're getting closer, Novak yelled, his hands flying over the consoles as alarms blared across the bridge. We can't outrun them much longer, Commander. Voss gritted his teeth. We don't need to outrun them, Novak. We need to make them regret chasing us. The crew exchanged looks. They all understood the stakes. There was no turning back. The next few moments would determine their fate, and perhaps the fate of humanity itself. The energy signature was growing brighter now, more intense. It was an ancient power, something far beyond anything they had ever encountered. But as Voss looked at the data, he saw something else, a pattern. The energy was pulsing in waves, almost like a heartbeat. Could it be alive? Was it a weapon or something else entirely? Commander, Ramos shouted, the energy source is directly ahead. We're too close to it now to turn back. Whatever happens next, it happens now. Voss nodded, his eyes narrowing in focus. Prepare for a rough ride. Brace yourselves. With a final surge of power, the Nova's light dove into the heart of the graveyard, the ship's hull vibrating as they neared the energy source. But just as they did, the Judicator fired another volley. The blast hit the Nova's light hard, shaking the entire ship. Sparks flew from the console, and a loud alarm filled the air. The shields were almost gone, and the hull integrity was rapidly deteriorating. Yet they pushed forward. We're almost there, Voss shouted. Just a little longer. And then something unexpected happened. The energy pulse, which had been building in intensity, suddenly surged outward in a massive shockwave. The Nova's light was caught in the pulse, the ship groaning as the energy washed over it. For a moment, everything went still. The crew held their breath, unsure of what to expect. But as the shockwave receded, something changed. The Judicator and its fleet, which had been closing in, suddenly faltered. The energy signature had not only overwhelmed the Nova's light, but it had also affected the enemy ships. They were now struggling, their systems malfunctioning, and their weapons faltering. Voss couldn't believe it. The power of the graveyard's energy had turned the tide, at least for now. We did it, Novak exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. "The enemy ships, they're losing power. Their weapons aren't responding." Voss's eyes widened as he saw the enemy fleet starting to slow, their once formidable power now useless against the overwhelming surge of energy. The Judicator, in particular, was struggling to regain control. The great ship, once a symbol of fear and dominance, was now just another vulnerable target. "This is our chance," Voss shouted. "Take them down, all of them. We end this now." Ramos, despite the damage to the ship, didn't hesitate. The weapons on the Nova's light roared to life once more, and the ship fired. The blasts ripped through the hull of the nearest enemy ship, tearing it apart. The once feared Judicator was now reduced to a drifting wreck, its power systems failing. The crew fought with everything they had, their desperation and fury propelling them. They had been hunted, but now the tables had turned. Humanity was no longer the prey. It was the predator. For hours, the battle raged on. The Nova's light and its crew fought tooth and nail, pushing through the relentless assault of the enemy forces. They were outnumbered, but the ancient power of the graveyard was on their side. The crew held the line, their bravery and tenacity turning the tide in their favor. But Voss knew that this wasn't the end. The battle had been won, but there were more enemies out there, more threats to humanity's survival. As the last of the enemy ships fell, the crew took a moment to breathe, to take in the fact that they had survived. But Voss's mind was already on the future. Humanity had proved itself once again, but there was still much to do. "Prepare for what comes next," he said, his voice steady, but filled with resolve. "We've won this battle, but the war is far from over." The crew nodded, their spirits high despite the many losses. They had survived the impossible, and now they would fight to ensure that humanity would never again be underestimated. The graveyard had given them power, but it had also given them a warning. There would always be more challenges, more battles to fight. But for now, humanity had proven one thing to the galaxy: they would not be broken, they would not kneel, and they would never stop fighting. The crew of the Nova's light was battered, weary, but resolute. After the intense battle, the silence on the ship's bridge was deafening. The alarms had stopped ringing, but the air was thick with tension. They had survived, but the battle had taken a heavy toll. Voss stood at the front of the room, staring out into the cold, endless void. The enemy fleet had been crushed, their power shattered by the surge of energy from the graveyard's core. But that wasn't the real victory. The real victory lay in what had been accomplished. Humanity had taken a stand. After centuries of being pushed to the edge, they had fought back. No longer were they the prey. No longer were they the ones hiding in fear. Now, humanity was a force to be reckoned with. But there was still much work to be done. "Voss, we've done it." Novik's voice broke through the silence. His tone was filled with relief, but also uncertainty. "We've beaten them. But what now?" Voss turned, meeting his gaze. "Now we prepare, we regroup, we rebuild, and we hunt down the ones who sent them after us." The enemy fleet might have been destroyed, but the shadow of the Judicator was still looming over humanity. The empire that had sought to break them had not been wiped out completely. It was a dangerous game they were playing, and Voss knew that the galaxy would not be a peaceful place for long. The data from the graveyard was still coming in, and Voss couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just the energy surge. The readings were erratic, almost as if something in the graveyard was trying to communicate with them, but he couldn't quite decipher it. They had barely scratched the surface of this new power, this new weapon. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about harnessing that power, learning from it, and using it to ensure humanity's future. "We need to secure the graveyard," Voss said. "It's the only way we can guarantee our survival. There are too many forces out there, waiting for the moment to strike. But if we control this power, no one can stand against us." The crew of the Nova's Light agreed. They had fought together, built together, and now they would rise together. The momentary victory was just the beginning of a much larger war. The battle for humanity's future wasn't over, but for the first time in centuries, humanity had something the galaxy could no longer ignore. As the crew continued to analyze the data from the graveyard, Voss stared at the star charts on the console. The Judicator's fleet had been a massive threat, but there were still other factions, other alien species that were waiting to pounce. The power of the graveyard could be the key to preventing that, but Voss knew they couldn't rely solely on its energy. The battle for control was far from over. "We're not done," Voss said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "The galaxy will see what happens when you push humanity too far. We'll make sure of it." The ship's lights flickered as the crew continued their work. Voss walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. He had led his crew to victory, but now they had to make sure it meant something. The next steps were crucial. "We may have won this battle, but it's time to prepare for the next one," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Our revenge will be swift, and we will show the galaxy that they made a mistake when they decided to challenge us." The room was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed the weight of Voss's words. The crew had seen the destruction, the chaos, but they had also seen humanity's resolve. No longer would they cower in the shadows. Humanity had fought back, and they would continue to fight until every enemy that had dared to challenge them had been brought to justice. In the distance, the remnants of the Judicator's fleet drifted aimlessly, broken and scattered. Their once mighty warships, symbols of fear and oppression, were now powerless husks. But there were other fleets, other enemies out there. The galaxy was vast, and the war was far from over. "Prepare the next phase," Voss ordered. "We start hunting the traitors and anyone who dares challenge us. The galaxy will fear humanity, not the other way around." The crew set to work immediately. It was time for a new chapter in humanity's story, one where they were no longer under anyone's boot. They had learned the hard way, but now they had the power, the will, and the fury to take on any challenge. The Nova's light powered up, its engines roaring to life as the crew set course for their next target. The stakes were higher than ever, but humanity had proven they could overcome even the greatest of odds. The war was far from over. But now, humanity was ready to take control, and they would make sure the universe never forgot who they were.